At 7:42 a.m. on August 17, 1943, Technical Sergeant James McKenna crouched beneath the left wing of a P-38 Lightning at Dobodura Airfield, New Guinea. The air was already thick with heat and the scent of aviation fuel. Across the tarmac, engines growled as another patrol prepared for takeoff. McKenna watched his pilot, Lieutenant Robert Hayes, making his final checks. 23 years old, 6 missions, no kills. The kind of statistics that meant you were running out of luck. Today, 18 Japanese Zeros were expected to intercept the morning patrol. Hayes would be flying straight into them. McKenna had been maintaining Lightnings for 8 months, long enough to know every inch of their design. Twin engines, twin booms, heavy, fast, brutal at altitude. A magnificent airplane on paper, except for one fatal flaw that was killing American pilots almost every day. The P-38 could not turn with a Zero. The Japanese fighter was lighter, more responsive, able to carve a full horizontal circle in half, the time the Lightning required. In the chaos of a dogfight, that difference meant the difference between life and death. American doctrine was clear. Never turn with a Zero. Use speed. Use altitude. Dive. Fire and climb. Hit and run. Don't get caught in a turning fight. But theory didn't always survive contact with reality. The Zeros were clever. They lured Americans into horizontal turns, cut inside their radius, got behind them, and opened fire. In 6 weeks, the 5th Air Force had lost 37 P-38s, most of them in turning engagements that the pilots couldn't escape. The manuals blamed the men. Pilot error, they said. Failure to follow doctrine. But McKenna knew better. The problem wasn't courage or training. It was mechanical. The P-38's aileron control system ran through the twin booms to the tail, then forward again through a maze of pulleys to the wings. Inside that web of cables was a small, factory-approved amount of slack. Just a fraction of an inch at full deflection, but enough to create a delay between the pilot's input and the aircraft's reaction. At high speed, it was invisible. At low speed, in a hard turn, that fraction of a second could decide who lived and who didn't. 2 months earlier, McKenna had mentioned it to the engineering officer. The answer came back cold and by the book. The cable tension was within specifications. Factory tolerance allowed for that slack. Adjusting it would void the warranty, and no field mechanic had the authority to modify flight control systems. Only Lockheed's engineers in California could approve such changes, and they were 7,000 miles away. So McKenna made a decision that defied every line in the maintenance manual. From the scrap of a wrecked aircraft, he cut a 6-inch piece of high-tensile piano wire, bent it into a Z-shape with a pair of pliers. His idea was simple. Install it as a makeshift tensioner on the left aileron cable. Preload the line just enough to eliminate the slack. The entire job would take less than 10 minutes. The risk could last forever. He waited until the hangar was quiet, long after midnight. The air smelled of oil and rain-soaked metal. McKenna worked by the trembling beam of a flashlight, shoulders pressed against the inside of the Lightning's left boom. Sweat and grease mixed on his hands. He dropped a clevis pin into the dark cavity of the structure, cursed softly, felt around until he found it again. His thumb slipped, and the pliers bit deep. But he kept going. The wire fought him the whole time, stiff and springy. But when it finally clicked into place, he pulled the cable by hand and felt it respond instantly. No lag. No play. Just tension. He closed the panel, wiped the blood from his hand, and checked his watch. 1:15 a.m. At dawn, the inspection crew ran their usual routine: fuel levels, ammunition, hydraulics. Nobody checked the tension of aileron cables. McKenna said nothing. He just stood by the flight line as Hayes climbed into the cockpit. The engines roared, twin propellers whipping the humid air into a blur. At 7:42, the P-38 lifted off, climbed into the pale morning sky, and vanished toward Japanese airspace. McKenna stayed where he was, listening to the echo fade into the jungle. He'd done something that could end his career or save a man's life. He didn't know which. All he could do was wait. The waiting was the worst part. Every time a formation took off, McKenna counted them in his head, and every time they returned, he counted again. There were always fewer coming back than leaving. He'd lost track of how many times he had watched a plane taxi out, confident and gleaming, only to see its empty parking slot hours later, a silent rectangle of concrete where someone's life had ended. The first one he'd lost was Lieutenant David Chen, Sacramento kid. Quick smile, always had oil on his hands from helping the ground crew. 3 weeks in theater, then gone. McKenna had checked his aircraft that morning. Fuel topped, hydraulics good, cable tension within specs. 2 hours later, Chen returned, holes stitched through his left boom. Over a cigarette, he told McKenna the plane felt slow, like it hesitated when he rolled to the left. The Zero almost got him. His wingman saved his life that day. 3 weeks later, on a different aircraft, the Zero finished the job. Same story. Caught in a turning fight. Couldn't roll out fast enough. Pilot error, they said. Then came Captain William Morrison. 11 kills. Veteran of too many dogfights to count. He knew every weakness the P-38 had. If anyone could fly that machine to its limits, it was him. On August 3rd, his flight met 8 Zeros over Oro Bay. Morrison downed one on the first pass. Then the enemy reversed. Radio logs recorded his last transmission. Controls feel mushy. Rolling out. And then static. Witnesses said his Lightning didn't respond quickly enough to escape. He was hit at 4,000 feet, no parachute. After Morrison's death, his crew chief Rodriguez tore the wreck apart bolt by bolt. Engines, linkages, surfaces, everything. All within spec. Nothing wrong. Pilot error, again. Rodriguez didn't believe it. Neither did McKenna. By mid-August, 17 pilots were dead. Names in logbooks, caskets in transit, ghosts on the flight line. The official language never changed. Failed to follow doctrine. But the doctrine was written for clean diagrams, not real skies filled with tracer fire. The Zeros were faster in a turn, more agile, and their pilots had learned the American habits like a script. If a P-38 tried to disengage, they guessed its role, cut inside, fired before the American could react. McKenna didn't need charts to know something was wrong. He could feel it with his hands when he tensioned a cable. The slight, loose vibration. The dead tone when he plucked it like a guitar string. Every plane on the line had that same faint slack, just enough to slow the roll by a heartbeat. And in combat, a heartbeat was eternity. He started listening differently. During maintenance, he would pluck the aileron cables and memorize their pitch. A tight one gave a high, clear ping. Loose ones thudded. They were all within regulation, but none felt right. He told Rodriguez one night, sitting in the glow of a kerosene lamp, while rain hammered the roof. "It's not the pilots," McKenna said. "It's the cables." Rodriguez nodded but said nothing. Both knew the truth wouldn't matter unless someone proved it in the air. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Hayes had been flying by the book and watching his friends die for it. 6 missions, no kills. Each time he followed doctrine to the letter. Dive from altitude, fire, climb away. Each time the Zeros twisted out and came back at him before he could line up another shot. On his 4th mission, a Zero's cannon shells shredded his right boom. He barely made it home. The next week, he lost his wingman, Thomas Parker, over Finchhofen. Parker was 21, from Boston, newly married. 2 Zeros had trapped him in a scissors maneuver. Hayes heard him on the radio, panic breaking through the static. I can't roll. Controls aren't. And then gunfire. Silence after that. That night, the barracks were quiet. No one spoke. Parker's bed stayed made, his locker sealed with a tag. McKenna worked late, cleaning tools he'd already cleaned twice, listening to the rain and the generator hum. He knew what the reports would say. Combat loss. Pilot error. And he knew they were wrong. The next day, Hayes found him in the hangar. He didn't bother with small talk. "Can you make it roll faster?" he asked. There was no challenge in his tone, no bravado, only fatigue. McKenna looked at him for a long moment and finally said, "Come back in the morning." That night, when the others slept, McKenna went back to the Lightning. He opened the panel again, ran his fingers along the cable, felt the soft give before it went taut. He thought of Parker's voice over the radio, the gunfire, the silence. He took out his pliers, bent another piece of piano wire, and worked until the sweat stung the cuts on his hands. The modification took 8 minutes. It might change everything. Or nothing at all. At dawn, the sky glowed red over the jungle. Hayes climbed into the cockpit. McKenna stood by, expression unreadable. Engines roared. The Lightning rolled forward, tail lifting, then broke free from the earth. McKenna watched it rise until it vanished in the haze. All he could do was wait. Again. The morning patrol reached the Huon Gulf just after 8 o'clock. The air was clear, the sun rising behind them, glinting off silver wings. Hayes flew number 3 position in a 4-ship element, steady and alert. Below, the sea shimmered like molten glass. Above, faint specks grew larger. Zeros, 9 of them, moving in tight formation. The call came over the radio. "Bounce them from the sun." The formation rolled, inverted and dove. Engines screamed. Wind howled over the canopies. Speed climbing past 380 miles an hour. Hayes picked a target at the rear of the Japanese line and pressed the trigger. 5 guns roared. Tracers streaked forward, white-orange lines cutting through the blue. A few struck, sparking off the enemy's wing. Not enough. The Zero rolled sharply right and dove. Hayes followed, instinctively matching the movement, and that's when he felt it. The airplane rolled instantly, clean and sharp. No hesitation, no lag between thought and motion. The stick felt alive in his hand, almost weightless. The Lightning snapped 90 degrees faster than it ever had before. The Zero filled his gun sight again. He fired a short burst. The tracers walked up the fuselage, tearing through the cockpit. The Japanese plane burst into flame and fell away, trailing black smoke into the jungle below. Hayes barely had time to register the kill before his wingman shouted, "3 more diving from above." Hayes glanced up and saw the sunlight flash off their wings. They were coming fast. He shoved both throttles forward, the Allison engines howling, but the Zeros had the advantage in the dive. Doctrine said to climb, run, stay out of the turn. But Doctrine had already killed his friends. Hayes rolled hard left, pulling into a tight reversal. The P-38 snapped into the turn like it was half its normal weight. The lead Zero overshot. Hayes pulled lead and fired. Cannon shells struck the left wing root. The wing folded. The plane spiraled down in pieces. The remaining 2 Zeros scissored to trap him, banking alternately to force an overshoot. Hayes stayed on them, rolling each time they reversed. The Lightning moved exactly as he willed it, like an extension of his own body. 1 Zero reversed too sharply and bled off speed. Hayes rolled inside, closed the distance to 200 feet, and squeezed the trigger. The Japanese fighter exploded, fragments hammering Hayes's right boom. For a second, he thought he'd been hit, but the engines held. The 4th Zero broke away and ran. Hayes let him go. His ammunition was low, fuel nearly gone. He leveled out, breathing hard, hands shaking. The fight had lasted 7 minutes. 3 confirmed kills. The rest of his flight reformed above him, silent except for heavy breathing over the radios. Nobody said much. They turned home. At 9:03 a.m., the Lightning touched down at Dobadura. McKenna was already waiting at the edge of the strip, heart pounding, scanning the horizon. When Hayes taxied in and cut the engines, the sudden silence was deafening. The canopy slid open. The young lieutenant climbed out, drenched in sweat, eyes wide with disbelief. He saw McKenna and walked straight toward him. 2 words. It worked. Neither man said more. They didn't have to. But they weren't the only ones who had seen it. From 15,000 feet above, Captain Frank Mitchell, leader of the 475th Fighter Group, had watched the engagement unfold. He'd seen Hayes's Lightning roll and snap in ways that defied physics. He knew every pilot in the theater, knew what was possible and what wasn't. What he saw made no sense. When they landed, Mitchell went straight to the debriefing room. Hayes was filling out his combat report, hands still trembling. 3 kills. Mitchell waited until he finished, then asked quietly, "What was different today?" Hayes frowned. "I don't know," he said. "The plane just responded better. Faster." Mitchell asked if maintenance had changed anything. Hayes hesitated, then said, "Talk to Sergeant McKenna." Mitchell found him 2 hours later in the maintenance bay, elbow deep in another aircraft, hands black with grease. "What did you do to Hayes's plane?" he asked. McKenna paused, looked at him for a long moment, and finally told the truth. The piano wire tensioner, the unauthorized modification, the risk. Mitchell listened without interrupting. When McKenna finished, he nodded once and said, "Can you do it to mine?" McKenna warned him. The modification wasn't approved, wasn't tested, could fail in flight. Mitchell didn't care. He'd lost 4 pilots in a month. Regulations could wait. Survival couldn't. That night, McKenna stayed late again. Same method, same wire, same secret. By dawn, Mitchell's aircraft had the tensioner installed. He flew it the next morning and came back grinning. "Feels like a fighter," he told his wingman, "not a truck." Within days, word began to spread. Pilots talk. Rumors move faster than orders in any war. Within a week, the story of a magic Lightning spread through the tents and mess halls of Dobadura like wildfire. Some dismissed it as luck, others as exaggeration. But those who had seen Hayes's fight with their own eyes knew something had changed. The P-38, once sluggish in a turn, now rolled like it had been reborn. Mitchell brought 2 more pilots to McKenna. They asked questions in whispers, careful to glance over their shoulders. "We heard you fixed something," one of them said. McKenna shrugged. "I adjusted the cable tension." The words were deliberately vague. What he didn't say was that the fix could get them all court-martialed. Still, he showed them how to do it. Cut 6 inches of piano wire, bend it into a Z shape, install it between the cable and pulley. 8 minutes, that's all. By August 20th, 9 aircraft carried the hidden modification. McKenna didn't sleep much. Every takeoff felt like a personal gamble. If one plane failed, if one pilot crashed, the investigation would uncover what he'd done. Yet each time they returned, the results were undeniable. Pilots spoke about crisper controls, faster roll rates, tighter turns. Mitchell scored 3 kills in a single engagement. Hayes added 2 more before the month's end. The change was spreading quietly, one mechanic at a time. Pilots who'd flown with the modified Lightnings couldn't stop talking about the difference. Their crew chiefs started asking around. Some refused. Too risky, too illegal. Others nodded silently and waited for the hangar to empty before working. The nights were filled with the clink of pliers and the low hum of whispered instructions. There was no paperwork, no signatures, no official acknowledgement, only trust and shared desperation. At Gooseup, hundreds of miles away, a crew chief named James Watkins heard about the modification from a transfer pilot who had flown with Hayes's group. Watkins was skeptical, but curious. He tried it on one aircraft. The next day, his pilot returned from a mission with his first confirmed kill in 8 weeks of combat. Watkins modified 4 more planes that same night. Soon, other crew chiefs in the 49th Fighter Group were following suit. By early September, roughly 40 P-38s across New Guinea carried the secret wire. Inspections continued as usual. Engineers checked cable tensions, but nothing appeared out of order. The tensioners were small, nearly invisible, and the mechanics removed them before inspections, reinstalling them after. On paper, every lightning was standard. In the air, they were something else entirely. The results were measurable. In July, the Americans had lost 2 P-38s for every 0 they destroyed. By late August, that ratio had improved to nearly 1 for 1. By September, the scales tipped the other way. Pilots were coming home with confirmed kills, and for the first time, the enemy was losing more aircraft than they were. In Tokyo and Rabaul, Japanese intelligence began noticing the shift. Combat reports from the 11th Air Fleet mentioned American fighters maneuvering more aggressively, rolling faster, and reversing direction with unexpected speed. The Zeros' signature advantage, their superior turn rate, was slipping away. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most respected aces, experienced it firsthand on September 3rd. He'd fought P-38s since the early days of the war and knew their rhythm by heart. The slow roll, the lag, the vulnerable moment before recovery. But over Wewak, the lightning he engaged didn't follow that rhythm. He tried his standard maneuver, draw the American into a turn, then snap back inside. It had worked dozens of times before. This time, the P-38 reversed faster than expected, nearly colliding with him head-on. Sakai broke off, startled. The American rolled again and came nose-on. Cannon fire flashed past his canopy. He dove away, shaken. Other Zero pilots returned with similar stories. "The lightnings are turning faster," they wrote. "They react before expected." None of them knew why. Nothing in the wreckage of downed American planes revealed a clue. Engines, weapons, control systems, all identical. The secret was buried deep inside the twin booms, hidden in plain sight. A 6-inch piece of wire worth more than any weapon upgrade. The psychological impact was enormous. For 2 years, Japanese pilots had dominated turning battles. They had confidence born from experience, the unshakable belief that no American plane could match them in close combat. Now that certainty was cracking. Pilots hesitated where they once attacked. They pulled out of fights sooner, doubting the timing they had relied on for so long. Aggressive tactics turned cautious. Commanders noticed. Reports of increased American agility reached higher levels. Nobody could explain it. Some blamed fatigue, others weather conditions, even superstition. But inside the cockpits, pilots knew something deeper had changed. They were no longer the hunters. By mid-September, the pattern was unmistakable. Japanese fighters were falling from the sky in numbers not seen since the early days of the war. The Zeros still looked graceful in the air, but their edge was gone. Lightning pilots were outturning them, outrolling them, and most importantly, outliving them. The kill reports told the story in cold numbers. 38 Japanese planes destroyed in 3 weeks, 22 P-38s lost. For the first time, the ratio favored the Americans. But numbers couldn't capture the real shift: morale. The American squadrons at Dobodura felt it first. For months, they had watched their friends die. Their confidence eroded one loss at a time. Now, for the first time, they were the ones coming home alive. Pilots who once stared silently at empty bunks were laughing again. retelling fights where the lightning moved like it was finally awake. The transformation spread through the camp like a rising tide of belief. In contrast, the Japanese were unraveling. Veteran Zero pilots, once arrogant in their dominance, now returned shaken and uncertain. Their after-action reports grew shorter, more cautious. One officer described the new P-38s as behaving unnaturally, as if controlled by ghosts. Tactics that had worked flawlessly through 1942 and early 1943 now failed with alarming regularity. Attempts to retrain pilots produced little change. They were fighting an enemy they could not understand, and that terrified them. The shift rippled outward, from Dobodura to Gusap, from Gusap to Port Moresby. Entire units began flying with the hidden modification, though no one admitted it aloud. The mechanics removed the tensioners before inspections and replaced them afterward, keeping their secret intact. Engineering officers sensed something odd in the reports: improved maneuverability, higher pilot survival, but no documented changes to hardware. It didn't add up. Yet no one wanted to push too hard. Success had a way of silencing questions. Then, one quiet morning in October, a maintenance inspector at Dobodura noticed something off. Two aircraft that should have had identical cable tensions gave slightly different readings. The discrepancy was small, fractions of a pound, but enough to stand out on the log sheet. Curious, the inspector followed the cables through the left boom and found something he'd never seen before: a small, Z-shaped wire wedged neatly between a pulley and the control line. It looked improvised, but well-fitted. He wrote a report, attached a sketch, and sent it up the chain of command. The memo moved slowly, crossing desks from field officers to engineering command in Brisbane, then finally to Wright Field, back in the United States. Each level added a note, a question, a recommendation for further evaluation. No one wanted to take responsibility for endorsing an unauthorized field modification, but no one could ignore it either. Meanwhile, the war went on. The men in New Guinea kept flying. The mechanics kept bending piano wire in the shadows of their hangars. They didn't talk about it. They didn't need to. The results spoke for themselves. By November, Lockheed engineers were officially aware of the modification. A small team was dispatched to investigate. They arrived at Dobodura in crisp uniforms, stepping out of a transport plane into the red dust of the strip. McKenna watched them from a distance, wiping his hands on a rag. He knew what this visit meant: either vindication or punishment. The engineers inspected several aircraft, measuring cable tension, stress loads, and control responsiveness. They took notes, asked polite questions, and never once accused anyone directly. At the end of a week, they called a meeting. McKenna wasn't invited, but Mitchell was. When it ended, the captain found McKenna by the maintenance shed. "They're not mad," he said. "They're impressed." Lockheed's conclusion, sent to the Army Air Force Engineering Command later that month, was simple and stunning. The field modification was safe, effective, and should have been part of the original design. The company began integrating a similar pre-tensioning mechanism into the new P-38J model entering production in December. No one mentioned McKenna's name. For him, it didn't matter. He hadn't done it for recognition. He'd done it so men like Hayes and Parker and Chen might live to see another dawn. But still, part of him wondered what would happen next, whether the truth would ever be told, or whether it would vanish into the silence of classified reports and forgotten paperwork. The new P-38J rolled off the line in California that December, with a subtle but crucial change hidden inside its wings: a refined version of the same tensioning system McKenna had built in the jungle, with a pair of pliers and a piece of scrap wire. The engineering reports called it an improvement in roll responsiveness due to enhanced cable preload. No mention of field improvisation. No reference to the desperate mechanics who had made it work months earlier under the light of a single lantern. By the time those new lightnings reached the Pacific, the tide of war had already shifted. American fighters were pushing deeper into Japanese-held territory. Hayes was still flying. He had survived missions that should have killed him, and every time he climbed into the cockpit, he ran a finger along the edge of the control column. A small ritual, a silent acknowledgement of the mechanic who had given him back the fraction of a second that meant life instead of death. He flew 63 combat missions before the war ended, 11 confirmed kills. He went home to Iowa in 1945, married the girl he had written to throughout the war, raised 4 children, and spent the rest of his life flying crop dusters over the same flat fields where he'd learned to drive a tractor. Every August 17th, he called McKenna. The conversation was always short. "I just wanted to thank you," Hayes would say, and McKenna would answer, "You already did." Frank Mitchell survived too. His squadron went on to fight through the Philippines and into the final campaigns of the Pacific. He became known among younger pilots for his calm leadership, and for one particular piece of advice he repeated whenever a mechanic brought him a problem. "Listen to your sergeants. They see what engineers miss." After the war, Mitchell stayed in the service, rose to colonel, and retired in 1963. Whenever he told stories about New Guinea, he always included the one about the mechanic who fixed the lightning's soul with a piece of piano wire. McKenna left the Army Air Forces in 1946. He returned to California, opened a small garage in Long Beach, and went back to doing what he'd always done best, making machines run right. He didn't talk about the war. To most customers, he was just an old mechanic with steady hands and a soft voice who could make an engine sound better than new. If someone asked about his service, he'd shrug and say, "Fixed airplanes, that's all." Decades passed. The jets replaced the piston engines, and the world forgot the Lightning and the men who kept it flying. Then, in 1991, a military historian digging through maintenance archives stumbled across a curious note in an old report, a reference to a field modification using piano wire tensioners. He followed the trail through veteran registries and eventually found McKenna still alive, 73 years old, working part-time in his shop. When the historian arrived, McKenna met him with a handshake still firm despite the years. He listened as the man explained what he had found, then nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "We did that. It wasn't anything special. Just needed doing." The historian estimated that the modification had saved between 80 and 100 American pilots' lives. McKenna didn't seem surprised. He just said, "I never counted. I remember the ones who came back." The historian took a photo before he left. The old man standing beside a faded black and white picture tacked to the wall. In it, a young mechanic in coveralls leans against the landing gear of a P-38, the tropical light glaring off its silver skin. On the back, in careful block letters, someone had written, "August 1943, New Guinea. James McKenna died in 2006 at the age of 88. His obituary in the Long Beach paper was brief. World War II veteran, aircraft mechanic, beloved husband, and father." It mentioned his years of service in the Army Air Forces, but not the modification that had changed how American fighters rolled and fought. There was no medal, no citation, no official acknowledgement. At Pacific View Memorial Park, his grave lies among neat rows of headstones, facing west toward the ocean. Visitors rarely stop there unless they know what they're looking for. A few old pilots from the post-war reunions did. One of them, an aging colonel with shaky hands, once placed a small coil of piano wire on the grass beside the marker. "That's for you, Sarge," he murmured. "The garage in Long Beach still exists, under a different owner now. The office walls are cluttered with old photographs and fading memorabilia from another era. In the back corner, there's a single frame, a black and white snapshot of a young mechanic beside a P-38 Lightning. The caption reads only, 'New Guinea, 1943. Most customers never notice it. The ones who do rarely ask. But that picture holds more than a face. It holds a moment that changed the course of the air war in the Pacific, and the lives of men who might otherwise have vanished into the endless lists of missing airmen. It's a reminder that innovation doesn't always wear a uniform heavy with ribbons. Sometimes it looks like a grease-stained sleeve, a drop of sweat, and a man willing to do what needs to be done while everyone else waits for permission. The Lockheed engineers who eventually replicated his idea never knew his full story. The reports credited field data analysis and combat feedback. That was fine with McKenna. Recognition had never been the point. What mattered was that pilots lived to see home again. In the great machinery of war, heroes are often measured in kills, medals, and missions. McKenna never fired a shot, never flew a sortie, never heard the applause of victory. But every time a lightning rolled faster, every time a pilot pulled out of a dive and saw the sky instead of the ground, his work was there. Silent, invisible, irreplaceable. Years later, when historians tried to quantify his contribution, they spoke in terms of statistics: improved kill ratios, reduced losses, technical efficiencies. They missed the human truth. His invention wasn't born in a laboratory or approved by a committee. It was born out of frustration, grief, and the stubborn refusal to accept that within spec was good enough when lives were being lost. And that's how innovation really happens in war, not through memos and conferences, but through men like McKenna, working alone in the heat and darkness, turning what little they have into something that keeps others alive. No headlines, no glory, just a quiet defiance that echoes far beyond the battlefield. If you found this story as moving as we did, take a moment to honor the people behind the machines, the mechanics, the engineers, the hands that kept the engines running. Because history isn't only written by those who fight, it's preserved by those who make sure others can.